how long does it take an organization to detect something might be anomalous? And then how long does it take for you to fully respond and recover from that? We have found historically organizations on average take 6 days to respond to a cyber incident when adversaries are now exfiltrating data in hours.
Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and have the privilege to sit down with two leaders in the cyber field from Palo Alto Networks. First, we're going to hear from Andy Piazza, who is a senior threat intel leader at Unit 42 at Palo Alto Networks and a longtime veteran in the field and a longtime veteran in the Army. So thrilled to have you, Andy. Thank you. And also Daniel Kroese, who is a longtime veteran of policy-making circles, both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Served for a long time on Capitol Hill, staff director of House Homeland, former chief of staff to the new CIA director, John Ratcliffe, and also served at CISA. Thrilled to have both of them here. We're going to be talking about a new report they just released, and it's the Global Incident Response Report of 2025. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining. Andy, I thought we'd start with you, and I understand you just came off a long flight from Singapore, so
Indeed.
Thank you for joining us. But thought we'd start with what you think some of the key findings are of the report itself.
Sure. I think there's a lot of great stuff in the report itself. I think it'll resonate with a lot of different people and different perspectives. The pieces that stuck out to me as someone who, my job, as you mentioned, is threat intel. We chase bad guys, as I say, really trying to understand the intent and capability of threat actors. So seeing the speed of attacks coming out of this report, right? Attackers are really moving faster. Mm-hmm. That worries me as a defender, right? That means we also have to be moving faster. We also saw with our own testing using, AI and attacks with our red teams that we're able to move faster using that as well. So just that scale and speed that we're seeing both from the real world, from a threat actor perspective and our own testing, that really stood out to me this year. That is something that I always worry about is, in the security field, we track our mean time to detect and mean time to respond. I also kind of think of it as like mean time to attack, not to throw another acronym out there for people to memorize, but just really how fast that attackers are moving. So for example, in 25% of the cases, we saw attackers exfiltrating data within 5 hours of initial compromise. That is really, really fast. That means from a SOC perspective, they got to get to that alert. They got to dig in, figure it out, and try to get ahead of the threat actor and block them in 5 hours. It's a pretty fast turnaround for most organizations.
Are we seeing pre-indicators that can sort of help the defender shrink that time? Because ultimately, are they looking for additional credentials, or are they going right for the gusto day one?
So we see a lot of use of what we call initial access brokers, which means the credentials have been compromised somewhere else, whether that was in a previous breach of that organization or on someone's personal machine that works for that organization. The challenge with that is, if you pop my personal machine, you compromise my personal machine, my SOC can't see that. There's not a whole lot of security tools compared to my enterprise, but that has my credentials potentially from remote login. So we see initial access brokers selling credentials to organizations. That means that attacker now, that second time they come in or the first time they come into the enterprise, they're logging in as you. They're logging in with legitimate credentials. That's a lot harder for a SOC to see, right? Now we have to start baselining behavior of where do those logins come in. If they're not using malware, they're just using tools that are inherent in that organization's enterprise, right? We talked about living off the land techniques. Mm-hmm. Now there's no malware necessarily involved. They're logging in as you using tools that are already installed by your organization. Now we really have to start doing behavioral analysis and what we call no normal defined evil. Makes it much harder. We're talking about
no normal defined
evil. That's a quote from SANS Institute training. I'll give them credit. But it's really kind of the premise as a threat hunter, right? You have to understand the behavior that you expect to see and start to look for abnormal things.
And is Palo Alto Networks, are you integrating behavioral tools into your...
Absolutely. From both products and services side, right, we have quite a bit of behavioral analysis. Also, my team behind the scenes, if customers have their telemetry turned on, my folks are hunting. We have a managed threat hunt service for specific clients, but my researchers were hunting across all telemetry, and we're looking for specific TTPs and behaviors. Of course, we do use indicators of compromise as well, but we really want to focus on those tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs. When we find that behavioral stuff, we'll notify clients, and we'll also pass the information to the product security teams to be able to enhance our detections.
One of the takeaways that I thought was also very interesting in the reports and your findings is the shift, and not that it didn't always exist, but much more disruptive and or destructive attacks. So a little more CNA than CNE or something in between. Absolutely. Computer network attack and exploit. And the stats were pretty staggering. 2024, 86% of incidents involved some sort of disruptive activity. That's pretty big.
Yeah, the one thing I want to point out there is when you first read that and you're okay, but ransomware has always been disruptive. What's more disruptive about that is kind of the first thought that actually hit my head was when I first read the draft, I was like, ransomware has always been disruptive. But we're actually seeing is these actors intentionally going after, deleting backups or deleting critical systems and really actually not just encrypting data, but really taking out systems or infrastructure. And then moving on to additional disruption of extorting customers or reaching out to the customers of customers, trying to get, one of the companies I use for data service gets compromised and they get my data, they're reaching out to me to try to put additional pressure. Mm-hmm. So if you're in the middle of a breach response and now your customers are calling and saying, hey, ransomware operator, talk to me, what are you doing about it? That puts a lot more pressure on that company in terms of extortion, right?
And are you also seeing more from a campaign planning perspective, adversarial use, maybe a DDoS attack coupled with a ransomware incident, or did I miss interpret
No,
that?
I definitely think, if you hear the shift in our language over the last few years, it used to be APT and cybercrime, but really we start now talking nation state and cybercrime because a lot of these cybercriminals criminals are advanced persistent threats. They are.
Yep, absolutely.
They are really...
and some of them are proxies for foreign nations anyway, right?
We've seen some overlap this year. We've had some interesting response reporting. We have a threat research article out from a few months ago where we believe that North Korea operated. It looks like they operated in hand with Play ransomware group, or there's some overlap at least in their initial access brokers. So definitely seeing some nation state overlap, but really just seeing some of the techniques. What we call a group Muddle Libra, most track is Scattered Spider, because we need more names in this space. The way we've seen them operate in the networks, they look almost like sysadmins, right? System administrators with their skills from a tooling perspective. So that's why I really want to talk about nation states, and cyber criminals really are, in many cases, can be APTs as well.
And even if they are more traditional ransomware gangs or cyber crime enterprises, many of them are provided safe haven in countries that we lack extradition treaties with, and even if we did, they're not coughing them up because they serve their interests on occasion.
They do, but I will say, attribution still does matter, right? We've been able to impose some costs on threat actors regardless of where they operate from. We've had some really good wins in the last year or two, right, with law enforcement takedowns and disruptions. You look at like Lockbit, right? They're nowhere near the top that they were in their prime. Not a lot of their folks were majorly, arrested or going into countries where we could have interrupted with them. But law enforcement takedown and disruption of their systems have really taken them off the top of the totem pole from a cybercrime perspective.
And do you see the ability to scale some of those activities? Because there are so many good examples of onesies and twosies, including recouping ill-gotten gains. But what I struggle with is that's a one-off sometimes. How do we scale that? Because quite honestly, if we want to induce changes in behavior, we're going to have to raise the calculus to the adversary.
Honestly, I think it probably fits better into Daniel's category of policy,
right? We'll get there.
Where we see, I think we've seen the increase in law enforcement disruptions and indictments and stuff as wins that are snowballing and getting the law enforcement community and the legal community realizing that they can get some easy wins out of this. We, from a vendor perspective, I know my partners across a number of companies, we share information with host, law enforcement in a number of countries. We're happy to try to interrupt those operations. We have the data, we have the visibility. We need the law enforcement partners and the legal partners too, right? I know plenty of law enforcement are happy to go put cuffs, but they also need the lawyers and attorney generals behind them to go give them the authority. So. As we see more wins, I think we'll get more policy support for those types of takedowns.
And we're going to pull in the policy discussion in a second. But you mentioned DPRK, you mentioned North Korea, and one of the findings that I also found quite interesting was the greater use of insider threats. And when you look at it, obviously the insider threat is always going to be at the very top of the list in terms of causing harm. And from the U.S. perspective, whether Edward Snowden or insider threats are always going to be big issues. But what findings did he find on the North Korea case?
So the North Korea stuff is really
And is it human-enabled cyber, or is it vice versa?
No,
or both?
It's an interesting mix, right? We're seeing. So my team's been tracking what we call contagious interview and wage mole, two of their major campaigns. Wage mole is where they're getting the IT workers embedded into companies. Contagious interview is where they're targeting IT workers and trying to infect them. Both of those campaigns have been going on for a year plus now.
Pretty sophisticated, too. I mean, LinkedIn and
Well, and what
others,
stands out to me is you think about previous North Korea campaigns, other than them going after kind of the crypto markets. You think
they
about,
still do.
Right, they're still going after those guys.
Yeah.
But you think of the previous campaigns, you think of like the big fire in the pan splash, right? Like the Sonys, the Swift breach. One big moment, not a long, persistent campaign.
Sustained, yeah.
And with Wage Mole and Contagious Interview, we've been, like I said, the same campaigns for a year plus. And in the case of Wage Mole, we're seeing that's where they're getting their employees hired as either contractors or IT staff within companies. We're seeing, whether it's Americans or Europeans, depending on which country we see them operating in, we're seeing internal employees enabling their operations, enabling multi-factor authentication pushes when they need to get the additional codes, or doing physical touches on YubiKeys, those types of things. We also saw them installing keyboard management devices, KVMs, keyboard, video, and mice devices physically into infrastructure on the back of computers. What's scary there is those devices have remote access through Wi-Fi or cellular, which means all of the command and control that we're seeing going to that network is not going through that enterprise's security stack. That the only tools now is anything that's on the endpoint. So if they don't have an XDR, EDR type solution, they're only relying on network security. All of those commands, that exfil is going across a network that no one else can see.
And to transition to a little bit of the policy discussion, I always thought of North Korea. So traditionally, organized crime, criminals try to penetrate the state and influence the state. In North Korea's case, it's sort of the inverse. It's the state penetrating organized crime. And they've done it pretty sophisticatedly for a country. If you look at midnight and get a satellite shot between the south and the north, one's lit up like a Christmas tree, the other pretty damn dark. So in a way, they're doing some interesting work. So let's transition a little bit into the policy discussion. But before I do that, I want both of your thoughts on, and you did capture this in the report, but sort of where AI. So we've had a gazillion discussions around artificial intelligence and the good, the bad, the ugly, and the unknowns on this podcast and also in a lot of our events. But where do you see adversarial AI, red versus blue? Where do we think this can change? And we'll let Daniel jump in on some of this here.
Yeah, for me, it's the scalability of a campaign. You think, and I hate naming victims, but this is basically the name of the breach at this point. But you think about the SolarWinds campaign. That backdoor was present, and we believe in thousands of organizations, but the threat actors really only able to operate against probably a dozen or so because they're using human operators at that point. We're seeing both threat researchers and actual bad guys investigating how to use AI. There was I believe it was the Black Mamba malware family was written to replace instead of the malware, it was the human operator doing the command and control with an AI bot. So when that malware checks in, it's giving it additional commands. We think about, I'm no longer limited by how many humans I need to operate 1,000 pieces of malware or 1,000 infections across enterprises. If we can scale that, and now I can have it collect data, do some lateral movement, do some exfiltration, and then do a kind of ChatGPT style summary of all the stolen documents, give me some bullet points. Now I can have one or two humans impact 1,000 organizations, read that output, and decide, okay, I do want to go dig into that spreadsheet or that database that we stole. That scale is something we haven't seen before, but it's definitely doable with the automation and the scalability of AI.
And Daniel, let's pull you in now. So before we get into sort of some of the good work you've done on policy priorities for the new administration, let's dig into this AI discussion a little bit.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Frank. So recognizing that we have to be eyes wide open and sober about the threat landscape and how adversaries are leveraging AI to increase the scale, speed, and sophistication of attacks, as Andy just laid out. Without hyperbole, as a company, we truly believe that AI is going to be a game changer for cyber defense. It already is. And to illustrate that point, I think there's a stat from the report we're talking about that to me perhaps is underappreciated, and that is in 75% of IR cases, logs existed that would have alerted the defender that something malicious was taking place. So you can either look at that as really frustrating or really encouraging statistic, depending if you're a glass half full or glass half empty guy. I think it shows that we're actually first and goal, to use a football analogy there. Good work has been made by the industry to invest in tooling and sensors to give us visibility, to give us logs that something malicious might be going on. So then it begs the question, well, what is the bottleneck? What is preventing that investment from yielding better cybersecurity outcomes? And it's that we're drowning in data. Those logs existed. We invested in the thing to get the log, but we couldn't find it or make sense of it before it was too late. And that really reinforces that better cyber defense is a data problem, which means it's solvable. And what is the best way to solve a thorny, large-scale data problem? AI. And that's probably a good segue to the policy conversation.
Yeah,
but we can leverage AI so that it is no longer that it is 75% of IR cases have the logs. They won't be an IR case because they would actually be able to identify it before it was too late.
And that's assuming the signal to noise that we are constantly updating what we plug into that learning model, though, right?
Absolutely. And to give you an example, obviously we are a commercial company and our goal is to innovate like crazy to stay ahead of the bad guys. When we have innovation that we think is world-class, we want to test it on ourselves first, eat our own dog food. So we have an AI-powered SOC called XIAM, which ingests data from any vendor you use across attack surfaces. So the network, the cloud, the endpoint, attack surface management tools, identity, beyond. It pulls it all together. So we started testing this out on our own environment. We ingest 59 billion security events a day across our own environment into that tool. Using AI, that is triaged down to one incident that requires human SOC analysis. So you think about that upside down pyramid.
So what's the time savings there? I'm bad at math, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but that's serious, right?
Yeah, and it frees up people. I think our stats are it's essentially a 65-person full-time equivalent savings. Those people can be pushed to more proactive threat hunting. So no longer are analysts overworked and playing an inefficient game of alert whack-a-mole. They're actually focusing on staying ahead of the threat. And so that's a really encouraging stat. And it's not hypothetical. That is happening today, and that can happen for any other organization tomorrow. I think that's why we are ultimately cyber defense optimists.
And I'm happy to hear that because I always pay attention when something bad happens, and unfortunately it's a whole lot of the time. But we do need to start flipping the script, flipping the equation, and I do think AI could play a significant role in all of that. And this is not to get philosophical, but and certainly not to be the Chinese fortune cookie equivalent of that in 30 seconds. But the old thinking of endpoint solutions alone and moats and the like, that's dead, isn't it? So in a weird way, you still need to protect that by all means. You still need walls, you still need castles that need to be scaled, but it's really about freeing up people to do the more proactive, we used to call it active cyber defense related matters, but is that fair?
Precisely. And another stat in the report that stood out to me.
Sort of like having linebackers, not just a line, right?
Exactly.
In a football analogy.
Yeah, so we started with first and goal, and now we're talking about layers of defense here. But 70% of attacks we observed had 3 or more attack surfaces that were leveraged. So not looking for one point of weakness, network, cloud, endpoint, and beyond. Multifaceted attack, which just means that your defense has to be multifaceted, and you have to be able to ingest data points across all 3 of those layers in real time and have people do the thornier, more analytical work.
Which will always exist. I mean, one of my lines is technology changes, human nature remains pretty darn consistent.
Yeah.
Maslow's hierarchy is going to always be, I think, in place in one way or another. But I do think leveraged right, we can at least balance it out a little bit. Let's go to your priorities for the new administration. So we've done some work on that, and dare I say, I forgot to tee up in the intro. You're one of our newest senior fellows, so we're thrilled to be able to draw on some of your work there, Daniel. But what were your big takeaways?
Recommendation number 1, and this is a recommendation that we provide to any interested audience right now, not just the Trump administration, national security officials as they've come in, but we've had, of course, productive conversations with them. Recommendation number one, and it sounds self-evident, but I like to triple underline this one. It is time to focus on cybersecurity outcomes, measurable cybersecurity outcomes. That sounds obvious and self-evident, but it is really easy in the cyber industry to fall into an input trap. We know the threat landscape is scary. Andy and his team and his colleagues at other companies, they do great work rooting out all sorts of scary things about the backdrop. And so as a result, what do? Well-intended efforts across government and industry, new requirements, new funding streams to deploy this thing or deploy that thing. And so we've gotten really good at well-intended and incrementally helpful efforts to invest in cyber defense and create new requirements for tooling and sensors. Sort of the final frontier is, are those making us safer? Like, how do we know that investment and deployment is actually making us safer?
So bringing a little bit of science to the art.
Yeah, and there are two terms or two metrics as a company that we really care about. And what we like about these is you could explain them to anyone who's not technical. And Andy mentioned these earlier. Mean time to detect and mean time to respond. MTTD and MTTR. Those terms describe exactly what you think they describe. How long does it take an organization to detect something might be anomalous? And then how long does it take for you to fully respond and recover from that? We have found historically organizations on average take 6 days to respond to a cyber incident when adversaries are now exfiltrating data in hours.
Yeah.
We can actually have real-time statistics around mean time to detect and mean time to respond. So in that recommendations, one of them we put out there, the President of the United States should be able to walk into the White House Situation Room and for every federal agency, see a real-time stat on that. What is our detection and response time? That is a huge departure from helpful, well-intended previous efforts that produce sort of annual scorecardy type things. But we have the data to have real-time accountability for how nimble we are in our cyber defense, and then have oversight and investment to improve those metrics.
So pulling on that thread a little bit, and this is an item you and I have had many discussions over the years on, is how do we translate so government can look at its own networks, and whether it's CISA or others, in terms of looking at the civilian .gov networks, industry their own, but it's the magic between the two, translating the nouns into verbs around public-private partnership. Yes, no?
Yes, absolutely. But the good news is there's a lot of what we're seeing across attack surfaces. You can anonymize who the entity is. It is, what are the vulnerabilities are you seeing, whether it's an electric utility, a state and local government, or a federal agency, right? What are the digital doors that remain open that we need to close? So how can we take that global view and then understand from a risk management perspective, where's the best bang for the buck?
I'm glad you brought up managing risk, because especially when we're looking at OT environments blending very quickly with IT and the broader IIoT sets of issues, I mean, at the end of the day, it is about managing risk, right? I mean, I don't think, maybe you guys have some real magic bullets there, but we're never going to be in a position where we can say we can protect everything everywhere all the time from every perpetrator and every modality of attack, right? So it's about managing risk, battening down the items that are most essential to one's company, country, agency, whatever the metric is. Is that still the way to think about this?
Well, I talk about it a lot now. If you were to start a business today, you would never have on-premises servers or any of that. Everything's going to be in the cloud, right?
Yep.
You're going to probably even bring your own device for the first few years to save some money. Your folks are going to use their own computers. And think about that attack surface now, right? You've got a bunch of different OS versions and out-of-date patches and all of that going on in your environment. And you've got cloud visibility. I've been involved in cloud breaches in the past where it was like software as a service, where you get the notification as a client and they're like, hey, not as an individual, but as a paying company, you get that notification and you're like, oh, that's important to us. Can you give us the logs? And it takes 2-3 weeks for them to carve out the logs for your section. Like in a startup company, the first 5-10 years, they're not going to care about security or not going to prioritize it over everything else, right? So we're talking, I think generally when we talk about security best practices, we're really talking about that kind of top 1% of businesses. Most aren't even able to really understand where their risk and threat landscape is yet.
And as a startup, you're literally prioritizing getting a business up and running, security is still going to be an afterthought, even if you did want to do everything, right? Because you just can't afford it.
Customers and salaries first, right?
Absolutely. Daniel, you touched on the cloud, and I will ask you whether or not it should be designated a critical infrastructure sector, but that's a sidebar conversation. But you did mention the cloud in your priorities for the Trump administration as well.
Yeah, there's a huge cloud migration going on as workloads transition to the cloud for many of the reasons that Andy talked about. It's more scalable, it's more cost efficient, it's more nimble. If you're a startup, it's the way that your storage and compute can be dialed up in your garage on day one. That's a good trend. I think Gartner estimates that,
it pushes it pushes the responsibility out of the hands of the individual to others who ostensibly have the wherewithal to protect, right? I mean, just from a conceptual standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Gartner estimates that by 2027 or 2028, close to 80% of workloads will be cloud-based. So this migration is happening. A key feature of that migration that's often lost, we're not just going through cloud migration, we're doing a multi-cloud migration, particularly at the federal level. You're seeing a lot of efforts at large agencies where they're not using just one hyperscale CSP, they're sort of the split the baby, let's have multiple options dynamic. And so asset visibility from a risk management standpoint has always been a challenge. We frequently find that organizations have double the number of assets touching the public-facing internet than they thought they had.
And that's not even including bring your own device to work, as we talked earlier, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And then the dynamic nature of cloud, how IP ranges can be spun up or spun down, that just further challenges the asset visibility issues with cloud security. And then you throw on top, well, maybe it's not just one cloud, maybe you're multi-cloud and it's 3 or 4. So it really comes down to visibility. You can't protect what you can't see. And so one of the recommendations in the blog that you referenced is let's embrace the cloud migration and multi-cloud migration, but don't forget about cross-cutting security. You have to have the ability to have visibility across all of your cloud workloads, both visibility and then operational control from a posture management, a runtime security perspective.
And that visibility is essential, and that brings up the big supply chain set of questions we're all struggling with. I maybe I'm wrong, but this is years ago that I led an effort for the government. We didn't have visibility. Is that getting better?
Depends. the classic InfoSec answer. It depends. One of the stats from the report that stood out to me for our incident response report, right, is 70% of the incidents we saw targeted 3 or more of the attack surfaces of the customer, whether that's endpoint, their network infrastructure, their cloud infrastructure, or as we talked about with DPRK, having the humans involved. 70% of the cases just really strikes home how complex that threat landscape is.
Or they did surveillance on all of them and waited till they hit the button, right?
And then you talk about moving stuff out to the cloud. We see a lot of exfiltration in the cloud. No enterprise in their right mind is going to block cloud IP space by default, right? Because they don't want to interrupt business operations. So when threat actors, again, it's almost a form of living off the land, using cloud sync tools and using cloud environments to exfiltrate data. They happen to own that cloud instance instead of the defender, but the SOC doesn't necessarily have that visibility or the speed in that visibility. And asset management gets a lot harder when, the old days we just dropped agents on endpoints and slowed them down with all the agents. Now we're talking about not knowing when a new cloud instance is stood up, or I've seen companies where business units got new software as a service, didn't go through IT, so it definitely didn't go through the SOC. And you find out because you had a breach that, oh, by the way, we had a bunch of data up in this partner's network.
And Daniel, anything to add to that?
In the incident response report, just to further foot stomp that point, 40% of cloud incidents were because there was unmanaged cloud assets that were out there. And so that's one of those sort of frustrating or encouraging, because it's fixable stats, where 40% of cloud incidents, it was an incident because he didn't even know you had a thing to protect. That's where so if you can just create that visibility, now you're all of a sudden in the game from a defense standpoint. You can't secure what you can't see.
And from a government policy standpoint, there's a lot of talk on SBOM, software billing management, all good concepts, but it's largely an analog solution to a digital problem, isn't it? Because there's so many parts and parts and parts. I'm reminded of the old parts is parts, the old Wendy's commercial. But at the end of the day, it's hard. It's hard because I just don't know if that's what most companies are thinking. So before they call a Palo Alto Networks, they do have to start doing some of their own, understanding their own environment, right?
So I think the SBOMs really help in a traditional supply chain attack or compromise. We're talking about the Log4js, where some type of piece of software got compromised. Environments I was a government contractor at the time when Log4j came out. It took us some weeks to figure out which pieces of software had it in there.
Yep.
So at a minimum, that's going to help us drive down our response time, right? That MTTR, right? If we call that a key KPI, right? Key performance indicator. That response time is huge. I was at another organization when SolarWinds happened. It took us 2 weeks just to identify all of our SolarWinds servers. A third
and that's
week
quicker than most, because I'm telling you, I'm not sure they still...
Third week to identify that we weren't, and I'll put this in quotes, impacted. But if you're on an IR bridge for 3 weeks straight, even though you weren't infected, you're still impacted.
Absolutely.
We still spent the same amount of time and money, right? So I do think SBOMs can help drive that down.
And I would agree with that. And they're well-intended, but it's not the panacea in any way, shape, or form. Or is it? Maybe I'm missing something.
I think identity is, if you could only invest in one thing, it would be identity protection. Enforce multi-factor authentication for administrators. Do identity access reviews. You look at the way we used to control back when it was just simple, right? Quote unquote simple. Active Directory and domain controllers. Our domain admins, they had usually, if you're in a smart situation, they had separate login credentials for the domain admin account and the domain controller. And we literally had envelopes for the SOC that said break glass, and we would lock them in a safe. And that was how the IR team could become a domain admin if they were in the middle of an IR case. When we went to the cloud, we're seeing a lot of over-privileged accounts. One, because we're just trying to get the cloud to work as we're migrating. How we do identity management in one cloud provider is a lot different than the other. And we'll just see that the administrators for the cloud will have all the permissions they need on their regular account, which means if I pop that single user's account, now I have their admin too. We need to be looking at policies where we say, just like we used to do on-prem, if you're an administrator using a cloud service, you should have a separate account with separate credentials with multi-factor authentication in place, separate than what you use as a user.
You're preaching my gospel there. I really do like because at the end of the day, even if you can't prevent everything, you can be resilient, but to do that, you need the identity management tools in place. So, Daniel, anything to add on that?
I think that also plays into, post SolarWinds Zero Trust. There was a lot of effort in the federal government around that, and some initial Zero Trust deadlines were hit September 30th of last year, but that's a never-ending journey. The idea that you're going to have continuous inspection and continuous trust verification across all assets, all users, all domains, all applications, all locations, like that trust but verify principle, that's a never-ending journey. It's not just one widget you buy. And
you did have a concrete recommendation around that, Zero Trust, in through the lens of Volt Typhoon, did you not?
Yeah, I think there's an analog that potentially we could latch onto as a community. I mean, post SolarWinds, Russian APT, they breached, as has been publicly reported, I believe 9 government agencies. That was obviously a concerning moment. I think to many more concerning was the fact that they sat undetected for another 9 or 10 months after that.
Yep.
And so the response to that was one of the aspects of the response was to implement a federal Zero Trust strategy, which makes a lot of sense. You need layered defense in response to a compromise like that. In response to Salt Typhoon, I do think there is an opportunity, and there's no one silver bullet, but there is an opportunity to work with a lot of the providers of how can we marshal a similar Zero Trust effort across our telecommunications infrastructure. And of course, work is already going there. No one's starting from scratch because this is just a never-ending maturation process. But I do kind of think there is an analog. SolarWinds, Zero Trust federal networks, Salt Typhoon, Zero Trust maturation across some of our telecommunications backbone.
And you bringing up SALT and in essence the computer network exploit and espionage. I mean, most people would have thought the telcos, and they would have let you thought that they're pretty buttoned down. Was that surprising to you?
Well,
it doesn't surprise me because everyone.
I do think they take it seriously. Like these are serious companies with smart people who have invested a lot in security. So I don't think it would be appropriate to somehow say that they starting from scratch or haven't given due consideration. I just think as a community we always have these moments where you sort of take re-inventory and how do you best optimize your security posture and response, and Zero Trust I think is a place there where we perhaps can double down.
And you think it will marshal and mobilize the community to get to outcomes we're hoping for?
I do.
I hope so. With every crisis is opportunity, and I think that could be the case here. And to differentiate sort of salt from volt, from flax, from silk, I mean, all these typhoons, each one of them is a pretty darn bad day. Collectively, it's a pretty perfect storm, no?
Yeah, well, I think that really drives home, too, is we've seen with like the Salt Typhoon, at least the activity that we're aware of. Again, Microsoft hasn't published anything that definitively said this is their model, so we've attributed some activity to Chinese groups that we believe is probably likely Salt Typhoon, but without knowing what Microsoft saw first from a technical perspective, we can't actually say.
So you are using their name, though. You are going with the typhoons.
We have our own, but I will stick with the typhoons for the ease of the listeners, so they don't have to pull up the Rosetta Stone.
What is yours?
Oh, no.
That's okay.
Don't quiz me.
That's okay.
But what we saw with some breaches that were likely Salt Typhoon, if we had a model to compare it to, was the abuse of living off the land, using tools that were already there, using normal protocols as system administrators, and using identities that they'd compromised. Again, those are not things that
new.
The SOC alerts, right? You're not seeing malware necessarily, although Chinese groups have plenty of their own malware, plus they use quite a bit of a mix of publicly available malware. What we saw with Salt Typhoon specific investigations that we believe that we were on, they were being not necessarily quiet, but blending in with normal tools and TTPs of a system administrator, right? Again, it makes it really, really hard. You really have to know what normal looks like, and you have to have dedicated hunters who are looking for that. If we're able to free up folks with clearing out any alerts with AI that you've only got one alert a day, it means your SOC can go hunt. They can really learn what your environment's supposed to be doing. And you say, hey, that's weird. I've got two servers talking to each other in an interactive session. That should stand out. But that means you have to have humans going look for that to stand out.
Right? And you don't want to get complacent either, because the adversary has a vote in this. They can be a couple steps further. Daniel, how would you rack and stack the threat environment right now? Nation-state actor, APTs now, I think, are equivalent to where the big four were 2 years ago, actually, in terms of some of the criminal organizations. But
when you look at the last few years, you've seen a combination of operational disruption, which our report highlights is increasing in intensity. And then you've also seen an escalation of what you might think of as more traditional espionage in terms of trying to sit undetected and steal IP and government information, things like that. And so when you marry that together, I think that requires all hands on deck effort, right? There's no ability to sit quietly and declare victory there. It requires an evolved approach, because incrementalism is not going to stay ahead of that reality. When you've got a combination of escalating operational disruption and escalating espionage efforts, incrementalism isn't going to work. Not to just finish off with the buzzword here, but that is why we do think AI is a game changer there, because we have to automate absolutely as much as we can so the really smart people can go hunt for the new novel thing, as Andy was talking about.
Freed up. Gentlemen, what questions didn't I ask that I should have?
I like the last question. I wanted to hit on that, actually, the kind of where do I rack and stack? I will say, depending obviously on which customer you're talking to, if you're talking to the federal government, the nation states are obviously always matter for them, but let's be honest, we always talk about nation states or even cyber criminals stealing data. They don't steal data, they copy it. If they stole data, we would have taken that seriously a long time ago, because you wouldn't have had access to your data anymore. So they're copying it, right? So I'm trying to kill the term steal data, they're copying it. So it's a pretty low impact in the short term.
Although in ransomware,
but ransomware,
data,
right? They're
yeah,
actually real impact on businesses. Not just disruption, but financial impact on businesses, right? It's a billion-dollar enterprise at this point when you start adding up all of the different groups that are at play. So I say to 99% of organizations I talk to, they need to be looking at cybercrime long before they get nation states, right? When a few years ago, when Russia crossed the border in Ukraine, every client wanted a threat briefing on what Russia was doing and the impact to them, and I'm like, you need to be worried about ransomware. You're looking at the wrong threat.
Unless you're a critical infrastructure owner-operator, like a utility or
know your threat model is what we talk
water,
about, right?
Yeah, good.
Yeah. Know your threat model. Yeah. And I think having an honest conversation about what are we most likely to see and what's most likely to have the impact in the next few years, it's going to be,
criminal.
And even ransomware operators is a hard term now, since we've seen a lot of them move to just pure extortion without actual encryption. But you need to be looking at those cyber criminals and how are they getting in, stealing your data or copying your data and then extorting you for it.
Awesome. Daniel, what questions didn't I ask that I should?
I mean, not to turn the tables, I was hoping for a March Madness prediction.
Auburn all the way, man. There's no guessing on that one. So we got to get through SEC tournament first, though. What about you?
I'm a University of Washington Huskies fan,
Yep.
for better or worse. So, we had a trial first year in the Big Ten. So we'll reset and recoup.
Roger that. Well, it's going to be, they call it March Madness for a reason. So I don't have a crystal ball here, and if I did, I'd be betting right now. So, gentlemen, thank you for spending so much time with us today. Thank you for all the work you do every day, and appreciate it. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cyber Focus. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. Your ratings and reviews help us reach more listeners. Drop us a line if you have any ideas in terms of topics, themes, or individuals you'd like for us to host. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.